Nearly 10 o'clock in the evening of October 22nd, 1973, a young couple and their baby were driving home for the evening when the woman saw what she thought were children up on the road ahead. She stopped the car and, in the headlights, saw that the small beings were not children, but bizarre, hopping, silver-suited entities. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just another tinfoil hat. Welcome to my show. Today, we'll be discussing the intriguing case of the Slo-Mo silver Saucerians. Now, this case is truly fascinating because it involves not one, not two, but three independent sightings of what appear to be the same bizarre creatures in the Hartford City, Indiana area around October 22nd, 1973. Now, 73 must have just been an awesome year. There is a reason why David Webb entitled his book 1973 Year of the Humanoids. This truly was the year of some of the weirdest humanoids you could ever hope to come across. So, without further ado, let's begin. So chronologically, the first sighting was had by one Mrs. Debbie Cairns, who sometime in the day of the 22nd of October, 1973, was driving to her home in Hartford City when she saw these two 4-foot-tall beings, clad in silver suits, slowly cross the road in front of her. They stopped by the roadside, and as she passed, she claimed that they raised their arms and made a loud noise as though trying to scare her. Shortly after Mrs. Cairns' sighting, Mr. and Mrs. Donathan, as well as their young baby, were driving home from Mrs. Donathan's mother's house in Hartford City, Indiana, to their home some ways away. Mrs. Donathan was driving, and her husband was sitting in the passenger seat holding the baby. About a block away from their home, the vehicle rounded this small curve and a hill, and there, in the center of the road, was this patch of light. Mrs. Donathan claimed that she thought it was simply the reflection of a tractor's lights in the middle of the road, and so she just slowed down. Now, it turned out that the light was coming from what she believed were two 4-foot-tall children standing in the road, clad in these bright silver outfits. She said that the outfits were such a bright silver that this is what was causing this kind of reflective patch of light. She slowed down, and about 30 feet away from these two children, realized that they didn't quite seem to be children at all. Now, I'm actually going to quote Mrs. Donathan's description straight from the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or A.P.R.O. Bulletin, because there's something really oddly chilling about the description that she gave. Mrs. Donathan said, "They looked confused. They would hop up in the air, their feet would come up slowly, one at a time, and their arms would flop funny. They moved slower than humans do, and their feet and arms would go funny. Their feet came off the ground easily. They were a bright silver." Now, Mrs. Donathan said that she couldn't really remember how the head or even any other features of the body looked, aside in particular from the feet, which she said looked like they had boxes on them. She said that the silver suits appeared tight-fitting. Now, when she realized that she wasn't watching these two random, silver-suited kids dancing in the middle of the road, and instead was witnessing two kind of weird beings that she couldn't quite place, she became frightened and, screaming, "Oh my God," put the pedal to the metal and swerved around the strange little beings, which slowly and clumsily began making their way from out of the middle of the road. Mrs. Donathan was so just petrified from this incident that she kept driving past their home and on for several blocks until finally her husband, kind of calmed her down and stopped her in front of an old church. Mr. Donathan claimed that all he could, say that he saw were two small figures dancing in the middle of the road. He looked back when she sped by them and claimed that they seemed to be somehow on the other side of a fence in a cornfield, which seems odd that such slow-moving, clumsy creatures somehow made it so quickly off the road over a fence in a cornfield. Eventually, he even persuaded Mrs. Donathan to go back. Now, they saw some unidentified lights in the sky, but didn't pay enough attention to say whether they were truly anomalous or not. Other than that, they saw nothing. Now, the Donathans did report their sighting to local law enforcement, and Deputy Sheriff Ed Townsend and an unnamed state policeman responded, along with Townsend's friend, record driver and gas station owner Gary Flatter. Flatter would soon have the closest encounter with these strange little beings, but at the time the trio investigated the area of the sighting, all they really noticed was a bizarre high-frequency noise at one particular spot in the road. They returned to town, and then later, the state policeman in his patrol car and Flatter in his wrecker drove back to the area. It was At this time, it was around midnight, and Flatter decided that it was pretty much time to head home for the night. He wasn't seeing anything, and so he did exactly that. However, at a spot directly south of the Donathan sighting, he was shocked to see a parade of mammals crossing the road. And by a parade of mammals, I mean that he claimed to see rabbits, cats, a possum, a raccoon, all simply crossing the road in the direction opposite the Donathan sighting area. Now, as if this veritable parade of mammalia was not weird enough, Flatter then claimed that he heard the same high-frequency noise which he and the two lawmen had experienced earlier in the evening. This noise was audible even over the sound of his wrecker's engine. Upon surveying the area now, Flatter claimed to see two small silver-suited entities standing in a field to the north. Flatter described these beings as standing about 4 feet tall, covered in a tight-fitting silver suit that glared and nearly blinded him when he turned his spotlight upon it. He said that it was like halfway between galvanized sheet metal and a mirror, so, bright silver is no exaggeration here. Now, Flatter claimed that when he put the spotlight on them, he said that they turned, not just their heads, but their entire bodies, and he got the impression that they did not like the light. Considering that, again, the glare nearly blinded him, he turned it off pretty quick. Now that the creatures had turned to, look at the source of this light, Flatter said that he could see them more clearly. He said that they appeared to have these egg-shaped heads covered with a gas mask-like helmet that had a nose which ran from the mask to their chest. There were no facial features, and this is a really odd little detail. He said that the arms did not seem to end in hands or claws or any sort of appendage like that. Rather, they just seemed to end. He agreed that the feet seemed square, and said that these beings then began to move, as though in slow motion, jumping 3 feet off the ground in a manner that he described as looking like someone skipping a rope. Now, he said that they did this about 3 times, and then on the 4th, he claimed that they simply took off into the sky, vanishing into the dark. Flatter claimed to see red trace-like streaks coming down from where they vanished, and nothing more. The next day, Flatter, Deputy Townsend, and Mr. Donathan came back to the area to see if there was anything left over, and they did find these bizarre imprints, which looked like squarish heels in the ground. However, the ground was dry and not really taking footprints at all. So, were those left from something far previous? Were they left from the strange little beings? Who really knows? So this is a trippy little case, and truly it's very similar in narrative structure to a few others that I've covered here on the channel. The Glowing Globehead and the Slouchy Stockton Spooks, just to name a couple, in which a couple driving catches a glimpse of a strange figure or figures in the middle of the road. And this was not an isolated incident, in this area at that time either. According to local papers, the UFOs, or whatzits, as the Chronicle Tribune called them, were out in full force. However, regarding this particular series of events, it's intriguing here that no less than 3 separate people had sightings of these beings. And again, each one of these encounters is interesting enough in and of itself to warrant discussion. So moving chronologically, Mrs. Cairns' sighting, if taken by itself, I would almost be tempted to say was a hoax. Simply because it's kind of like someone reporting that they saw a ghost and it looked like a sheet over someone's head and then it said boo. This woman claimed that she saw these 2 short people, beings, whatever, wearing these silver outfits. They raised their arms and made a loud noise in what she believed was an attempt to scare her. However, given the similarities with the following encounters, it's not enough for me to discount that. Unless, maybe she had the highly coincidental treat of seeing someone hoaxing something, which then later on became an actual anomalous phenomenon. Who knows? But yeah, beyond that, again, she pretty much reported the same thing. The arm-raising type stuff seems compatible with the 2 later sightings. It's just that simply there's really not much else to go on with Mrs. Cairns' leg of the encounter. So the fact, though, that Mrs. Donathan and Mr. Flatter pretty much described almost exactly the same thing, I'm going to kind of group those 2 sightings together. First of all, the thing that really stands out to me is the fact that they reported that these beings were jumping in this weird fashion of their feet coming up one at a time and flailing their arms. And of course, this reminds me, perhaps unsurprisingly, for you devout watchers of this channel, of encounters with the fairies, who are often described as being seen dancing or leaping. Now, 2, this is definitely not like some outmoded behavior for anomalies. This tendency to hop or jump to cover, lots of ground in one leap has been seen in countless other anomalous encounters, whether with cryptids like, the Enfield Horror, this three-legged nightmare from Illinois, to entities observed in conjunction with UFO flaps, such as one of the beings observed in the Banbury UFO flap of 1971, just covered in my previous video. The silver color of the entities is also of major interest to me. So many encounters with anomalous beings, whether we're talking ghostly, UFO-related, or even from the fairy faith, even going further into some cryptid encounters and religious apparitions, detail shining beings. I've mentioned Paul Devereaux's theory of the proto-entities, the concept that sightings of entities and craft are often comprised of the same kind of, substance. They look like they're made out of the same material, or the entity may be clothed in or holding an object which looks like it's the same material as the saucer. And it's his concept that both of these, forms, this craft and the entity itself, are just comprised out of the same malleable energy. And so I find this kind of pattern of these shining, reflective, or bright entities definitely makes sense in that regard. Now, on this tangent, the fact that Flatter believed that they didn't like the light, and as a matter of fact, this was one of the only things that drew their attention throughout this series of 3 encounters, is something that I've noticed, as a definite pattern across tons of different anomalous encounters. It seems as though light, whether mundane or extra mundane, acts as a catalyzing force in these encounters, often affecting change on the course of the interaction. Now, a pretty unique, though definitely not unheard of, aspect of this encounter is the animal response. I mean, a whole kit and caboodle of different animals wanted to get the hell out of the area where roughly the sightings occurred. Now, whether this was due to the high frequency noise and what part that has to play in the experience, who really knows? Strange high-pitched noises, often compared to piping or whistling, are just another old standby of encounters with mysterious beings across every genre of paranormal research, and another force, in my opinion, which seems to be either primer or catalyst for the witness. I mean, in this case, Flatter didn't see the entities until he heard this high-pitched whistling. Finally, we have the, in my opinion, just ridiculous termination of the encounter. In this case, the beings literally simply just take off into the sky. The sense of unreality pervades so many of these anomalous encounters, and, a fair amount of nonsense as well. However, on the flip side, you have this, again, in my opinion, that aspect of the encounter of the beings kind of hopping and then just taking off into the wild blue yonder. It's ridiculous. It seems very silly. It seems nonsensical. However, you have these same entities observed by 3 isolated witnesses, as well as the rather ambiguous but still there trace evidence of these bizarre heel prints in the earth. So many of these cases, while we may be tempted to say it is purely a subjective experience, some sort of almost waking dream, it at least has to be a shared waking dream because you have this confirmation from 3 separate isolated witnesses. Now, although Flatter claimed to see some sort of gas mask-like apparatus or helmet on these beings, technically, this is another entity to just go ahead and toss in the faceless category, a common enough spot for entities across every field of anomalies research. One other thing that really stood out to me about this encounter as well is this concept of clumsy or confused entities. This is something that I've observed across many other paranormal encounters. I know this was even mentioned by Linda Godfrey as a description she'd heard about man-wolf sightings or dog-man sightings, that these beings seem somehow discombobulated. Given, too, in this case, the description of their movement as almost like slow motion, it seems like whatever these things are, they truly are a fish out of this plane of existence. Well, if you enjoyed this episode on the Slo-Mo Silver Saucerians, please like, and if you're new to this field of crop circles, go ahead and subscribe to see what weirdness the future may have in store. Till then, you can keep up with me on my free blog at patreon.com/justanothertinfoilhat. And for today, I am Zelia Edgar, signing off. Do